I arranged for Clint Marquardt, who is an industry sleep and fatigue specialist, to come in and talk to us about fatigue and some risks in a lunch and learn format after having several requests come in for information about sleep out of the control center, because we manage the risk of fatigue in the control center. So for today, he's going to be covering those things. And just for your awareness, we're recording this session so that your peers who aren't able to join us for lunch today can go back and review the material we're getting presented. So with that, if you have any questions and you're not comfortable with your screen or video or your voice being recorded, we ask you to please use the chat function, and myself and Albert will watch for your questions and make sure that they're brought to Clint's attention at the end of the session. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Clint, please.
Thank you very much, Charlene, and welcome everybody. So just as a quick note, I like to do these presentations in much more of a conversational style format. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to either put them in the chat bar, or if you're comfortable being recorded, just go off mute, ask them, maybe turn your video on too if you're really comfortable, and I'd be happy to answer them as we go through the presentation. If we'll have a short Q&A period at the end where you can ask more questions, and if you're still not comfortable asking questions in that format or that session, we'll turn the recording off after the formal Q&A, and I'll stick around for another 15-20 minutes. If you've got more questions that you don't want recorded, then feel free to ask me them then. So I'm not disappearing. I'll give you my contact information after we're all done. You can always reach out to me later on too, both for tips around managing fatigue within Trans-Northern, but also in your personal lives as well. So I'm here for you, happy to help you out. So just a quick little bit of a background for those of you who haven't met me. As Charlene mentioned, I'm a sleep and fatigue specialist. I've been working in the area for about 27 years, believe it or not. Find it hard to believe myself. Time has gone so quickly. I started my work in this area in the clinical and applied world. So as I say in the slide here, I started my life in behavioral sleep medicine, psychology, in the sleep clinics. And that's where I learned all about it while I was doing grad school. And from there, started to do some consulting work. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada then picked me up as their fatigue specialist in 2003, I guess it was. And that's where I learned about the pipe industry. So throughout my time with the TSB, and then afterwards, when I started consulting on my own about 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, so I'm not a pipeline expert, but I have done work for Enbridge, Trans-Northern, Savannah Energy, Metrolinx, TC Energy, ATCO, Interpipelines, Plains Midstream, and I've had a few other people on my training as well. So I know a little bit about it. And I have a pretty good idea of most of the fatigue-related risks that you're working with, because of course I work with shift workers all over the place. So that's a little bit about my background and how I started getting connected with your team here. And as Charlene said, we met at a SEPA meeting probably about a year or so ago now, if I calculated correctly. Okay. So before we get started, what I'd like to do is see how fatigued you are. See if you're going to have any trouble paying attention to this talk, and whether or not I have to, do some dances and things to keep you awake. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out or show you 8 different situations. And what I want you to do is use this rating scale to rate your likelihood of dozing off, the likelihood you would fall asleep in that particular situation. Now, for the situation, don't think of the situation as if you're in it right now, because your fatigue right now might be higher or lower than it normally is. Try and average it out across the last 3 weeks or so. Average it out across the time of day, average it out in your head to try and get an idea of, if we put you in this situation at any point in time, average time, what's the likelihood you would fall asleep? And you do this with a paper and pen, because you're going to need to add up your score in the end. So grab a piece of paper, pen, pencil, and get ready to write down. Okay, so the first situation. If we put you in a situation where you're just sitting down and reading, what's the likelihood you would fall asleep? And again, average it out across the day, average it out across the last, say, 3 weeks or so. 0 would be, again, no chance you doze off. 3, pretty good chance you're going to fall asleep, doze off. Maybe not fully asleep, but you might start feeling, your head, eye movements starting to change, the blink starting to change, and your neck muscle starting to relax too. Okay? So sitting down and reading, 0, 1, 2, 3. Next one, watching television. Now think for a moment about where you normally watch TV. You're normally in some place comfortable, friend's house, family house, your house. So if you fall asleep, well, who cares? People laugh at you, they giggle, doesn't really matter that much. Okay? Next one, it's slightly different than the one before. Now you're in a public place. So maybe you're in one of these huge shopping malls where they got these really comfortable couches and you can sit down and wait for your shopping partner to finish up shopping. Or you're in a meeting at work. What's the likelihood you would fall asleep then? 0, 1, 2, or 3. Next one, you're a passenger in a car and you've been driving for about an hour, no brakes. Now the condition here is you have to be comfortable with the driver. Okay? So you're not sitting in a passenger side sort of white knuckling it afraid. Comfortable with the driver, driving along for about an hour, what's the likelihood you would doze off? Okay? Next one, lying down, trying to rest in the middle of the afternoon. So hey, nothing to do, lie down, try and take a nap, what's the likelihood you'd fall asleep? Okay? So none of those pressures. What's the likelihood you'd fall asleep trying to take a nap in the middle of the afternoon? Next one, sitting down and speaking with somebody. So you're having a conversation with somebody, you're sitting, not standing, what's the likelihood you would fall asleep then? Okay. Another one, sitting down quietly after lunch, but lunchtime you haven't had any alcohol at lunch, no beer, no spirits, no wine. What's the likelihood you'd fall asleep then? And this time you're not talking with anybody, you're just sitting there. Okay. Next one, now you're not the passenger, but now you're the driver. And you've hit a traffic snarl, some construction, traffic jam, and you're stopped for a few minutes. In that situation, what's the likelihood you would fall asleep? Okay. Now add up your score, and we'll come back to that score in just a minute. What I just gave you was a very specific test, a test of a very specific type of fatigue. We call it sleep-related fatigue. This type of fatigue is related to sleep factors. So sleep and wakefulness factors result in the fatigue. Okay? This type of fatigue is a biological state. It signals to the brain and body that it needs something. So fatigue is like a symptom of the need for sleep or perhaps being awake for too long. It's not just this overwhelming feeling of tiredness, which I refer to as lethargic fatigue, and I'll explain again that term in a few more minutes. So this use of the term fatigue, we're using the word fatigue as a synonym for sleepiness. Okay? And sleepiness can range from extreme to very low levels of fatigue or sleepiness that you might not even be able to perceive. You might not even be able to notice. I mentioned it's signaling a biological need. So think of this type of fatigue, that is sleep-related fatigue, as a biological need like hunger. So hunger signals a biological need. It signals the need for food. So the only true solution for hunger is to eat. Give the brain and body what it needs. Same thing with fatigue. Fatigue is a signal that the brain and body needs something, and what it needs is sleep. So the only true solution here to fatigue is sleep. Okay? Other solutions are really managing it or fighting it or preventing it. And I'll give you some tips on how to do that as we move forward as well. Okay? So the test I gave you was not a test of a few other types of fatigue. It wasn't testing mental fatigue. So mental fatigue, if I were to drone on in this presentation, okay, let me change my voice now. I'll go really monotone. So if I was to talk like this for the next 3 or 4 hours and just make you listen to me for hours and hours and hours, it would be harder to pay attention to me. It takes mental energy, mental work to stay focused. Okay? So mental fatigue has a different source than sleep-related fatigue. Now, I know this is corny, and I can't tell if you're doing it because you don't have your videos on. So try this wherever you are right now. Take your hand, raise your arm. So it's not being supported by anything except your muscles. And now open and close the palm. Okay? Open and close your fist. Now do that for 3, 4, 5 hours. And think about the first thing that's going to happen. First thing that's probably going to happen is your arm is going to become fatigued. It'll be harder and harder to do this, and you'll have to stop doing this. Okay? Stopping doing this, resting your arm, is the solution. So the solutions for the different types of fatigue are different. Solution for this, stop doing this. So physical fatigue results from using the body strenuously for short periods of time or using it for a long period of time, a little less strenuously. Now, just because you're mentally fatigued or physically fatigued, it doesn't mean you're going to fall asleep more quickly. Okay? So it's a different type of fatigue, but people still describe it as being fatigued. Another type of fatigue is lethargic fatigue. This type of fatigue is usually due to people feeling sick or beginning to get sick, either with a cold, flu, or something more serious, or mentally ill as well, anxiety, depression, sometimes high stress levels. And people usually experience lethargic fatigue as a feeling of, I just want to sit here, sit in a lazy boy chair, lie down on the couch, and don't ask me to do anything else. I just don't have the energy to do it. In the sleep clinic, we would have frequently people coming in saying, I'm really fatigued. We would then get them to do the same test that you did, these situations, rate how fatigued you are, how likely you are to fall asleep in each one. And people who are lethargically fatigued wouldn't endorse the higher levels of fatigue. That is, they don't show that they're as fatigued as somebody who's sleep-related fatigue. So again, a different type of fatigue. It's really important to understand the different types of fatigue because, as I pointed out, solutions are different. To solve sleep-related fatigue, you have to address sleep and wakefulness. Mental fatigue, usually things like addressing workload or giving people mental breaks. Physical fatigue is disrupting or slowing down the physical movement, giving people breaks from movement. It's why when you're working out in the gym and lifting heavy weights, you typically have rest in between each exercise. Okay? Lethargic fatigue, you have to address the underlying situation or conditions there. So addressing the mental or medical health issues that are resulting in lethargic fatigue. Okay? So you have to think about all the types of fatigue. They all reduce your impairment or reduce your performance and cause impairments, but the solutions for each one are different. Okay, let's go back to that test I just had you do. It's called the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. And as I mentioned, it reliably distinguishes between the different types of fatigue. And it's important to understand the different types so you can know the solutions that you need to put in place. Okay? Check out your score and see where you fit on this range. If you're getting 1 to 6, you're doing pretty good. 7 or 8, you're about average. If we did this questionnaire across the average population, most people nowadays are a little more fatigued than we should be. So it means there's room for improvement. Just because you're average doesn't mean it's good. It means there's room for improvement here. And especially in safety critical situations, Charlene mentioned at the beginning, control room fatigue is an issue, sleep-related fatigue for the control room operators. So people in safety critical situations like those, we like to see them within the 1 to 6 range when they're doing the safety critical tasks. Okay? If you're scoring higher than 8, that is 9 or higher, there could be something serious going on, like a sleep disorder, or maybe you're struggling with shift work. So it's important, if you're normally that fatigued, you probably should be taking some actions around it pretty soon. If you're scoring 7 or 8, do some thinking about why you're that fatigued. Okay. Now, one of the challenges with sleep-related fatigue, as I mentioned, it ranges from being so fatigued, so sleepy, you can't keep your head up, okay, to very little fatigue where there's no overt signs of fatigue. So at the far end of the spectrum of fatigue, and by the way, this is my version of the spectrum. There's no agreed upon set of steps to become extremely fatigued. Okay? So it's just my depiction of it. But at the far left-hand side, where we're a little fatigued, you won't be experiencing, head bobs, changes in blinks, changes in eye movements, relaxation of the neck muscles. So if you're watching for those signs to tell you when you're fatigued, and then you're not experiencing them, and I ask you, are you fatigued? If there's no overt signs of fatigue, there's a pretty good chance you're going to say, no, I'm not fatigued. I feel okay. It's not until you get to the far end of the spectrum where you're moderately, very, and extremely fatigued that those physiological changes show up. Now, the challenge here is that your performance starts to drop, starts to become impaired as soon as fatigue kicks in. So that means when you're not very fatigued at all, things like your reaction time, things like your ability to pay attention start to become compromised. But you don't notice it because you're looking normally for the overt signs of fatigue. So this is one of the challenges here is it's difficult to know when you're fatigued until you're really fatigued, unless you know about the performance impairment. So if you're looking for impairments rather than the overt physiological signs like the head bobs, so if you're looking for slight changes in your ability to concentrate, or maybe a slightly slower reaction time, then you might be able to put 2 and 2 together and think, I'm probably a bit more fatigued than I think I am, and I should do something about it. Right? So that's one of the interesting challenges with sleep-related fatigue. Sleep-related fatigue, as I mentioned, its causes are different from physical, mental, and lethargic fatigue. The causes are all related to sleep and wakefulness, and normally changes to sleep quality, sleep quantity, or extended periods of wakefulness. Okay? So the 6 factors that I like to look at are short-term disruptions to quality or quantity, longer-term disruptions, so smaller disruptions, but for longer periods of time. This is what I refer to as chronic sleep disruption. Continuous wakefulness, so long periods of wakefulness. Circadian rhythm effects. So we have 2 very pronounced circadian rhythm effects. One is that middle of the afternoon, we start to feel more fatigued, and that's a normal biological rhythm. And then in the middle of the night, we normally feel extreme fatigue. Okay? Again, a biological rhythm out of our control. You can't fight it with your brain or mind power, Jedi mind power. You can't fight it. Right? It is there. It's a biological rhythm. Another form of circadian rhythm is if we have all these biological rhythms, and incidentally, there's rhythms to melatonin, cortisol. Scientists think there's probably about 100 different rhythms that wax and wane across a 24-hour period, and they're all cannot be controlled by your mind power alone. So if we have all of these rhythms going in a day, the body likes them to all be nicely synchronized. But if you're sleeping at all the times during the day, you're working some erratic patterns, they can get out of whack. They can become desynchronized. If you get so desynchronized that so many of them are out of whack, shall we say, you're perpetually fatigued. Doesn't matter what time of day it is, you're always going to feel a little fatigued. Okay. 5th fatigue risk factor, medical, psychological conditions, illnesses, and drugs can all impact sleep quality and sleep quantity. So I like to ensure that companies are taking that factor into consideration. And then although sleep disorders are considered medical disorders and could be grouped with risk factor number 5, the prevalence is so high that I think they should be addressed separately. Okay? Now, depending on the literature you read, the science you read, anywhere from 20, as much as 20 to 25% of the population is suffering from some diagnosable sleep disorder. Okay? Many more are suffering from sleep problems that don't meet the clinical criteria of a medical disorder, but are still impacting their daytime functioning. So the sleep problems are a big issue. Now, let's talk about, let me just go back one slide. Let's talk about 2 of these really interesting risk factors that are related to the finding or the idea that we need 8 hours of sleep for 24 hours of life. Okay? This is a pretty good average that most people need. The range of normal quantity of sleep is 6 to 9 hours. Right? It's heavily weighted towards the people needing more sleep than less sleep. So it usually averages out to about 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep per 24 hours of life, not per day, okay? Per 24 hours of life. Okay? So there's a slight difference there. So if this is the normal sort of textbook ratio, we can look at it from a mathematical perspective. Let me show you how this works. We use what I call the sleep-wake ratio. If the ratio is 8 hours of sleep for 24 hours of life, that means that if you take 24 hours of life, you reserve 8 for sleep, you're left with 16 hours of wakefulness. So in essence, 8 hours of sleep buys you 16 hours of wakefulness. In other words, 1 hour of sleep buys you 2 hours of wakefulness. So this ratio of 1 to 2 is a good rule of thumb to gauge or to look at some sleep, some fatigue risk factors here, and the 2 we're going to talk about. So the first one I want to talk about is the idea of a chronic sleep debt or chronic sleep disruption. Sleep debt refers to a lack of sleep over a period of time. Now, if you go online and just type in sleep debt calculator, you'll find all sorts of calculators, but they don't use the ratio I just gave you. At least most of them don't. So they're not quite as biologically accurate as the formula I'm going to give you, which takes into the consideration of 1 hour of sleep buys you 2 hours of wakefulness. Okay? So the formula you're seeing on the screen here is you look at the total sleep time in whatever time period you're looking at, and then you total up the total awake time in that same period. And because you need 1 hour of sleep for every 2 hours of wakefulness, you then divide the total wake time by 2 to see if you've obtained the right quantity of sleep for the observed quantity of wakefulness. And if you get a negative number, it means you have a sleep. So if you'd like, try this out. We'll walk through it, okay? I know sometimes it's hard to remember just how much you've slept unless something interesting happened during that night. Baby woke you up, thunderstorm, what have you. It's hard to remember sleep unless you're paying attention to it, or perhaps you're wearing a Fitbit or one of the wearables that tracks your sleep. But try to do the formula here. Okay, so we are now Wednesday noon hour-ish. Think back to Monday night and calculate the amount of sleep from the time you went to bed Monday night leading into Tuesday morning. Write that down somewhere. Now look at the sleep that you took starting from Tuesday night, so last night leading into today, and write that down, and then add that up. Now think about the wakefulness. So when you woke up on Tuesday morning, how long were you awake until you went to bed Tuesday night? Write that down. Okay. And now look at how long you were awake this morning up until now, and then write that down. Add up your wakefulness, add up the total sleep. Now divide the wakefulness by 2. Okay. Take the total sleep time you calculated, take away or minus the total wake time by 2, gives you your number. Typically, when you're working out a sleep debt, you work a longer period of time. 2 nights is not often enough to capture a true sleep debt. When I'm looking at sleep debt, I go back to the point in time where the person obtained the last 2 nights of good quantity of sleep. The research shows that in general, if you sleep for 2 nights, not days, 2 nights of sleep with good quality and quantity, that is about 8 hours, good quality, so not a lot of awakenings, it feels like it was a decent sleep, that refreshes you. It should get rid of most fatigue and bring your performance up to a satisfactory level. Okay? So that might have happened weeks and weeks ago, in which case you'd have to calculate your sleep debt all the way back to that point to get a much more realistic picture of where your sleep debt is at. I just wanted you to try out the formula to see if you got a sleep debt even today. Okay? All right, so how much of a sleep debt is too much? Well, let's go back to our ratio. 8 hours of sleep for 24 hours of life, which means that if you've calculated a sleep debt or accumulated a sleep debt of about 8 hours in the last